Θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω το Ελληνοαμερικανικό Επιμελητήριο για την πρόσκληση τη σημερινή, όπου θα έχω την ευκαιρία να συνομιλήσω με εκλεκτούς συναδέλφους από το Διεθνές Φορολογικό Δίκτυο της Taxand. So please allow me to switch in English in order to welcome my good colleagues from our Taxand network. So I have with me Liguori, Managing Director in Alvarez Marsal, Taxand US, Head of Corporate Transformation Tax Team, based in New York. Good morning to you all, and thank you for making it so early your time in the US. And Luis Vinuales, Partner and Head of International Tax Group with Garrigues, Taxand Spain, based in Madrid. Good afternoon to you,
Hello,
Luis,
Maria.
and thank you for making the time today. So,
thank you for the invitation.
Thank you. So we will be discussing the changing perspectives of taxation, touching quickly upon three basic elements: the new international tax order, the fair share of tax element, and tax being back in the board agenda, which to my mind are the most important elements of this changing tax environment. So I'd like to start by saying that tax revolutions take place after a big crisis. So back in the 1920s, that was the first turning point in the history of taxation when states gave up a little of their tax sovereignty in favor of a new bilateral tax treaty system that was launched then by the League of Nations and was later to become the OECD Model Convention. Now, that was dealing with alleviating double taxation at a time it was much needed after the First World War to boost cross-border commerce. Now, today, after a global economic crisis, the digital revolution, and the pandemic, we are faced with a second turning point in the history of taxation. So from the BEPS to last October's statement of the OECD Inclusive Framework on the two-pillar solution, we're dealing with a new set of rules facing the digitally transformed and mobile economy, and with a unique consensus, I may say, 137 countries already out of the 140 of the inclusive framework. So this time we're dealing with alleviating double taxation and disputes arising from the national measures we saw, for example, on the taxation of the digital economy, but also on double non-taxation in this new way of doing business. So what are the key points? The new nexus for allocation of the taxing rights, to jurisdictions based on where the consumers are, and the global minimum tax rate. So the turning point is about national and bilateral measures giving some ground to international and multilateral measures. So coming to you all, how is the US reflecting on the two-pillar solution, and how is this expected to interact with the US tax reform of 2017?
Well, thank you, Maria, and thanks for having me join this panel, and it's a pleasure to participate from New York. So let's talk about Pillar 2 first, and the global minimum tax. I think that one will be easier to discuss. To a large degree, Pillar 2 is already part of US law. Ironically, the prior administration, the prior presidential administration, put in place a minimum tax regime that, with some tweaking, will match up quite well with what Pillar 2 is designed to accomplish. That's in proposed legislation right now, as likely to pass, and it'll bring us closely into compliance with OECD Pillar 2. So very optimistic and positive that will move forward. Pillar 1, however, is a bit more complicated. Pillar 1 is not in any proposed legislation in the US right now. However, as many of you have probably heard, the current administration is signed on to Pillar 1, signed on to both pillars, in fact. However, it's a fairly complex political environment here. It's not clear whether passage of either pillar will go through. As I mentioned, pillar 2 is likely, but pillar 1 has a bit more political uncertainty on it. The administration believes that pillar 1, the new nexus standard, that it can be accomplished without legislation, without Congress. But a lot of practitioners and taxpayers disagree with that. And there's a heavy lobby in Washington from the large corporates. And although the large corporates appear to agree in principle with Pillar 1 in the media, it's not really clear what's happening behind the scenes in Washington. It's important to know that the Republican Party in the U.S. Generally wants to retain the right to tax the biggest U.S. companies. And they're questioning whether, under a Pillar 1 approach, why the U.S. should surrender tax revenues with no compensatory benefit. And that's an important element to think about, because what we just saw in our midterm elections here is that there's some shifting of popular support. And what I mean is that previously there was quite a bit of support for a very progressive democratic platform, which would have supported Pillar 1 quite emphatically. However, what we saw in the midterm elections is that because of world events since the last administration has taken over, there's been a bit of a shift from within the Democratic Party, I should say, to the right or into the minority. And what that means is that Pillar 1 has some political uncertainty associated with it. Whereas, going back to my opening, I think Pillar 2 has a strong likelihood of becoming part of U.S. law.
Thank you, Al. So turning to you, Luis, Greece and Spain are market countries and certainly welcoming these developments. What's your view on the key aspects of the two-pillar solution, and do you find this a feasible plan overall?
Well, Maria, thank you. You are right. Spain and Greece are market jurisdictions. I very much believe that Pillar 1 is about discussion or negotiations between countries of residence of the large multinationals and the market jurisdictions where these multinationals operate and do business. And, well, somehow, I tend to believe that the market jurisdictions have already won a part of this battle. I believe that now nobody questions that these large multinationals should pay taxes or more taxes in the jurisdictions where they operate. Whether these additional taxes are through digital service taxes or through Pillar 1, we'll see. Personally, I'm quite skeptic about Pillar 1 becoming a reality, and tend to be aligned with Al that Pillar 2 is probably already there. But I believe it's also important to think where all this is coming from. And actually, Pillar 1 is a kind of development of Action 1 of the BEPS action plan, which was about the digital economy, and was an inconclusive action. But actually it was the first action of the BEPS action plan, and probably the trigger of all the BEPS movement. And where all this BEPS movement comes from? Well, it's not something recent. It's not something of the last couple of years or 3 years. Actually, let me try to tell quickly an anecdote, something that happened 2005, 2006. I was at my office, and one of my partners came from a trip to London. He came to my office and said, Luis, look, we are about to see a revolution in the tax world. And I asked, well, why is that? I said, I'm coming from London, came out from the underground into the street, and I faced this demonstration in the street where people were claiming for a large multinational, very well known, I will skip the name, pay your taxes. So he was referring to people in the street claiming that the large multinationals should pay their fair share of taxes. That was 2005, 2006, don't remember exactly. But this colleague of mine said, we are about to see a revolution in the tax world. And he was very right. And that was the start or the beginning of everything. Probably large multinationals with the cooperation of tax administration that were favoring attractive tax regimes, with the help of tax advisors. Well, at the end of the day, probably they were not paying the taxes that the people in the street thought that they should be paying. And the discussion started. The discussion started, and there was this big support from the governments, I would say. And this mandate to the OECD to come with the BEPS action plan. And then once that everybody agreed that this, what has been called international aggressive tax planning, should be over, and that the large multinationals should pay their fair share of tax, the market jurisdiction raised their hands and said, hey, we want our piece of the cake. Probably, I many times say that if the US tax reform would have happened 10 years ago, I would dare to say that we would not be talking today about Pillar 1. The large multinationals, the tech companies, would be paying taxes in the US. The market jurisdiction would be collecting the indirect taxes that they have, but probably there would not be that claim. And then we have come to this Pillar 1, which in my view looks like a too complex solution to sort out a problem that probably could have been sorted out in a different way.
Thank you, Luis. And what's your view on the practical aspects? Because I think you quickly touched upon it. The practical aspects of having to implement what will basically be a multilateral instrument in order to implement Pillar 1. So I guess bilateral tax treaty system was an easy one because it was based on bilateral negotiations and on a loose treaty model. But what about having to amend a multilateral agreement to adapt to the challenges of the future? So how flexible will this be? Luis, do you want to comment on that as well?
Well, I believe that we already have some experience. I mean, the multilateral tax treaty that was signed now a number of years ago has not come in force in many countries yet. And that was something, in my view, far more easy to implement than Pillar 1. And well, it's true that it is becoming real. It is in force already in some countries, but there are still many parliaments that need to approve the existing multilateral convention. And again, in my view, that was far much easier than what we are trying to do with Pillar 1. So I foresee big, complex issues and difficulties that, in my view, will be extremely difficult to overcome.
And Al, what's your view about the implementation as regards who is going to look after for compliance on these rules? So we're not talking about a world tax inspector here. It's going to have to be the national tax authorities that will implement, that will make sure the new rules will be implemented. So how easy do you think this is going to be for the states, for national tax authorities to cooperate with each other?
Well, it won't be easy, Maria. I think the ease of this will be dictated by how necessary it becomes and how feasible it becomes within the political framework. You know, my view is that the the global taxation system and that of the U.S. has become a bit obsolete when being applied to these large digital models. But there's a significant number of people that disagree, that from a U.S. perspective, and perhaps that of many of the producer countries of digital models, there's a belief that the local tax authorities in other jurisdictions can effectively deal with the digital economy without a Pillar 1, for example. The concept here is that a fair share of a company's income can be allocated to where customers are located through more direct taxation at the customer level. And therefore, there's many in the U.S. that believe that Pillar 1 is not necessary. I personally believe it's necessary because those types of direct taxes are clumsy to implement and challenging, and they'll essentially be passed right on to the customers. And as Luis had pointed out, a big part of this movement has come at the customer level, and the popular reaction would be quite negative. So on the feasible side, whether this is politically feasible, I do believe that it's politically feasible. And it's good to remind ourselves that in the U.S., we've moved into a period of politics where the pendulum is swinging quite exaggerated in a quite exaggerated manner from left to right. And right now we're in a jurisdiction where the administration supports something like Pillar 1 because it benefits the world and perhaps puts the United States second. But the challenge is that the next administration might disagree with that. And that jeopardizes the possibility for short-term implementation here. However, I do believe that as the pendulum swings back and forth, it will likely come to a progressive approach, and U.S. multinationals will put enough pressure on Washington to ensure that they can compete globally, and will force reconciliation and removal of these one-off digital taxes that creates a nuisance for them. So I do think, Maria, that it is necessary and feasible and will ultimately happen.
Thank you, Al. So you both agree that despite the complexities, it's probably going to happen, perhaps not at the timeline suggested, but at some point. So we talked about the new way business is done, how mobile and digital, and what are the challenges faced that could not be dealt, Luis, I know you may disagree, but probably not by traditional rules. So, and you also both spoke about the new fairness element, the fair share of tax issue. So this fairness, I mean, tax always had to be fair, tax systems had to be fair, but this fairness discussion in this new tax, international tax architecture, what do you think of that? And I'll start with you, Luis.
Well, I mean, fairness discussion and whether Pillar 1 is necessary or not. Actually, let me make a remark. I mean, when I said that maybe Pillar 1 was not strictly necessary, I was having in mind also the fairness discussion, which is the tax administrations of the market jurisdictions have already reacted towards these large multinationals using the existing tools, using the transfer pricing assessment, using permanent establishment assessment. And actually, this is in the news, this is in the press. I mean, you can see that the large US digital companies that we all have in mind, well, they have faced tough audits in different European countries. And after these tax audits, they have sit down with local authorities to discuss about the fair taxation, about their fair share of taxes. And I believe that in jurisdictions like Italy, France, Spain, and I'm only mentioning those that have been in the newspapers, because obviously it's not a question of making anything public here. But, well, I believe that the tax administrations of those three jurisdictions now think that those large US digital companies are paying a share of tax, which is, if not fully fair, it is more fair than used to be before they took those actions. And those actions were taken with the existing tools. So, yeah, the discussion is there, but I believe that the administrations are there. And I believe that the role of tax advisors in this new tax world is to sit down with tax administrations and taxpayers, trying to make their positions closer in terms of defining what the fair share of tax is.
Thank you, Luis. And what's your view, Al?
Yeah, I agree with Luis, of course. You know, transparency in the U.S. has been a focus for some years now. But I would say, much like the revolution that Luis mentioned earlier, we're seeing a similar sea change in the U.S. and at the board level. So having the lowest effective tax rate is no longer the badge of honor for in-house tax. The requirement to, under ESG pressures, to be able to open the books and present the company's tax profile to the public in a proud way has really become a very valuable attribute of in-house tax and of the advisors supporting those in-house tax groups. The pressures at the board level that we are seeing today are really twofold. And I'm not talking about the big digital companies. I'm talking about the rest of the ecosystem of organizations here that we see. And what we see the boards focusing on is questioning how does this, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, for example, how do these changes catch these companies? Many brick and mortar organizations are digitizing their business models, and board members are concerned that nobody's paying attention to how these companies' digital models will be affected. And also, will the pursuit of the large technology companies be equally applied into the non-tech sector is also a topic that keeps coming up. But again, back to the ESG side of it, there is a good amount of pressure for U.S. companies to make sure they're paying their fair share of tax globally, that they can avoid public scrutiny, but also to make sure that they're staying competitive and to maximize incentives that are out there for ESG type programs. And so that's the big challenge, Maria, is for these non-technology companies to try to catch up to where the technology companies have gone already.
Thank you, Al. So I hear you both say that tax is back in the board agenda as part of the business strategy, and that has changed considerably the role of the tax function that has much more visibility and accountability on their shoulders. And besides reporting and compliance, they have to deal more with identifying the risks and opportunities out there and being transparent, as you said, towards all stakeholders, educating them and helping them cooperate with each other. So I will ask you both, what is needed by the tax manager of today? What's the critical skill set to be able to deal with the new challenges? So I'll start with Al this time.
Oh, I'll be quick. I would think that for most of the in-house tax people and for their advisors, the short answer is think like a digital company, think like a big tech company. They're several steps ahead of the rest of the economy on handling these matters, and there's no need to reinvent an approach. You can apply the principles and the approach that some of the big tech companies have done well.
And Luis, what's your view?
Well, actually, when I look at, in order to answer this question, what I normally do is to look at what I have been doing in the last 10 years, which has been devoting more time to discussions between taxpayers and tax administration. The tax scenario that we have before us is extremely complex. Legal certainty will always be an issue and will be more and more an issue. I believe that the only way of addressing and combating this legal uncertainty is through an open communication between taxpayers and tax administration. I know that I'm coming from a country, Spain, where let's say that the communication between taxpayers and tax administration has not been very fluent, but we are making huge efforts to make this communication more and more fluent, because we do believe that this is the future of taxation. Communication between taxpayers and tax authorities, transparency, negotiations, and trying to reach agreements on how companies will need to comply with their tax obligations, with these very complex tax obligations going forward. So communication between taxpayers and tax authorities with the help of tax advisors.
So Al, Luis, I want to thank you for sharing your insights with me. I really take the comment about how we all need to think and plan as technology companies, because there are quite a few steps ahead of us. To sum it all up, I heard you both agree that despite the complexities, the new international tax order is here to stay, and that calls for a new way of doing business, a more transparent, more sustainable, more cooperative way, where tax is at the top of the agenda and the role of the tax function is redefined into that of a business partner. But just before we end our discussion, I want to share with you what I read in the Financial Times. Successful companies will be those who can do their business as well in the open as in the dark. So just a conclusive remark from you. So, Luis?
Well, I believe you said it. Be open.
Correct. And Al?
Sounds like advice my parents would have given me a long time ago. I agree.
Thank you both. So thank you for attending our session. Hope you found it interesting, and enjoy the rest of the conference.